The following podcast was produced in-house for KQEK.com. The following are a series of true stories. In the summer of 1989, my father made the terrible mistake of letting me get a credit card as a co-signer, which kind of made it open season to visit record shops like Sam the Record Man, Cheapies, The Record Peddler, and Records on Wheels, and essentially go bonkers on vinyl. During my 20s, I bought a ridiculous amount of soundtracks, and the shameful part is that most of them are still in storage because of space issues. The first soundtrack LP I ever bought was Jerry Goldsmith's The Swarm. Now, I bought it as a joke, a memento from a silver screen turkey after reading about Irwin Allen's expensive dud in the Medved Brothers' The Golden Turkey Awards book. I paid for that LP using bottle refunds after dragging $3 worth of ginger ale bottles to Loblaws. Not because I was cheap, but because I was broke at the time. I saw the LP in a delete bin at Music World at Fairview Mall for $2.97 plus tax, and when I gave the album a spin, something strange happened. Instead of laughing at bad music, I played it again, and discovered Jerry Goldsmith and film music. Although in fairness, I'd also started to rewatch movie main titles like Psycho because there was something interesting in the way music and title designs clicked. I later swung by Cheapy's warehouse store by the Eaton Center, and in flipping through the soundtrack bins, I was shocked at how much music existed on LP. A bigger shock was the soundtracks that I'd never heard of, let alone composers. And one common denominator in every store was the overabundance of albums released by Varese Sarabande. The first Varese LP I bought came in succession because they released music from Rod Serling's original Twilight Zone series, which frankly may have been the best sampler to film music around because of the quality and variety of music by numerous composers, including Goldsmith, Bernard Herrmann, Nathan Van Cleave, and many, many more. The second LP that caught my eye was probably Hugo Friedhofer's Boy on a Dolphin, after which came many more spanning many music idioms and genres. But when CDs appeared and started to add more music than the vinyl pressings, the LPs became the dodo bird. And for years I only bought used platters for music that remained unavailable on CD. During the 1990s, many bootleg CDs coming from Europe, and some pretending to come from Europe, plus straight CDRs were, quote, released. Some were mastered from tape sources, LPs, and isolated DVD score tracks. But the dominant media for film music collectors was still the compact disc, and yet vinyl never quite went away. Vinyl's resurgence happened sometime when I was making the half-and-half switch from CDs to digital media, so I can't pretend to be an expert and pinpoint the precise where, the exact why, the specific how, or the more ground-level reaction of what the hell, although I did wonder why the platter was making a comeback with a generation that didn't experience it during its heyday. My initial reaction to a younger generation being attracted to vinyl is bafflement, especially when CDs had lost a chunk of the market. iTunes made buying music easy, and sites like Bandcamp democratized the market. But human ears know what sounds good, and some ears are more finicky than others, especially when a certain sound, a genre, or format makes an indelible impression. Now this is a long preamble to my interview with Varese Sarabande's A&R rep Cary Mansfield, but there's a reason I'm blathering a bit. It is a different market that's driven more by collectability than the music itself. And like DVD and Blu-ray collectors, there's something wrong when a platter is bought but never spun and just rests on the shelf. Now, I should be ashamed of having several hundred platters by Varese, Intrada, Cloud9, GNP Crescendo, GRP, AEI, Citadel, Dot, Cole Records, MCA, Warner Brothers, and more sitting in boxes. But as any collector of anything knows, space has a premium cost, and vinyl is, quite frankly, a monster. I'd never go back to the binge buying of the past. The prices today of colored platters make snapping up monthly releases prohibitive. But I'm good with selective buying if it's music that I love. Besides, finding what music clicks with buyers is what every record label strives and struggles to maintain. At one point, Mansfield corrects me in the interview, but from what I recall reading in a few collector publications, the last soundtrack LP, score, not song, produced and released by Varese was Jerry Goldsmith's Leviathan back in 1989. Now, by 1989, the label had released a variety of scores, but the quality of the vinyl stock was always pretty solid. And when recordings went to digital, using combinations of digital mics, recorders, and mixing consoles, Varese issued digital LPs, curious nomenclature which, like laserdiscs, ultimately played back music in an analog format. The quality of vinyl was generally quite good, and their standard for mastering, production, packaging, and graphic design were always first-rate. This was the norm that I grew up with, so it was a surprise to read of the label's decision to release limited LPs. To my mind, this marked a major return by a venerable soundtrack label to vinyl after a decades-long absence. The three platters released so far are The Bourne Identity, The Matrix, and themes from Scream 1 and 2. And I've posted a review of the Bourne LP at KQEK.com purposely because I wanted to hear how a digital score I know and love on CD sounds when remastered for LP, as piped through a 40-year-old Marantz amp. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Varese Sarabande's Cary Mansfield.
One of the aspects that I wanted to talk about as well is just this. It's kind of hard to call it now resurgence of vinyl, just because.
Well, it's been happening for 10 years now.
Yeah, it's been going on for quite a while, and I remember what sort of started off as kind of a surprise, if not kind of a little bit of snickering about the fact that vinyl is being pressed again. Is now it's more than viable. It's also saving record stores.
Thank God. Well, I mean, in terms of my background, I mean, I've been doing this a long time as far as reissues and vinyl. I mean, I do work on some soundtracks. I do a lot of, mostly the pop soundtracks, and Bob Townsend does all of our scores. But I've been working at Varese for 22 years, and my emphasis has always been on the pop titles. I have a whole catalog of more than 1,000 titles of pop releases I've done over the years. I'm still doing them, too, because that's always been my area of expertise. But I've been a big vinyl collector myself for years. I mean, I have about 10,000 vinyl albums myself, and they're all originals. They go way back to when they first came out. So this is great for me. And I always kind of look at this, to me, as sort of the anti-digital movement, because although I would say the people's motivations for buying them now are not necessarily the same as they were before. Because before it was like the only configuration you can get. Now I think it's different, and there's also a younger audience for it. So it's interesting who it appeals to. I'm not sure necessarily that it appeals to people who bought them originally. I mean, like some of these, like to me, if I already have an original album by the Beach Boys, why do I need a reissue for? It's like I've got the original. So even though, unless of course I need a better copy, that kind of thing. But I'm sure there's a lot of different motivations for people buying it as opposed to in the old days. Obviously it was like the only thing you can get. But I think it's kind of cool. It really is. And obviously it still seems to be going strong, and definitely is helping record store day for sure.
Yeah, because I think there was an article not long ago, well, maybe a year ago. I think it might have been in like The Guardian or The Independent in Britain, and they were saying that HMV kind of went from near bankruptcy to being, I guess, solvent at this point, or remaining solvent, simply because people started to buy, or younger generation started to buy physical media again, and that included vinyl. And I know that for some of the collector titles, I mean, there's a substantial, I guess you could say there's a substantial markup between the wholesale cost versus what the retailer can charge. But I imagine that for independent labels,
because these records are very expensive to make. I mean, there's not as much of a markup as you think. I mean, it's really not. I mean, in terms of the differences, because manufacturing is more money, obviously, because there's fewer plants, and also we're talking about, special, like for example, we'll do 180 gram vinyl, and a lot of times we'll do original art for it, so we'll create new art for an older album because people love that. That's an additional expense. Or we'll add, colored vinyl, which is certainly more expensive. I mean, there's all these different picture discs. These are all things that cost a lot more money than it used to, and so consequently, you're not making a lot. It's really based on units. If you can sell enough units, then maybe you can make some money. But it's not going to, make you rich.
From a comparison standpoint, then, there's a whole series of factors that have popped up in a number of articles in terms of the challenges in putting out vinyl, both for independents and for established labels.
Right.
And the fact that when vinyl was being phased out, there was a lot of equipment that essentially was junked, as well as the know-how that sort of evaporated. And, from what I was reading, I understand that there's sort of advanced booking that's happened with some of these limited plants where you have to have everything organized in advance because you're competing with other labels that are trying to get time to actually press the records.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, we're working, for example, with a plant in Buena Park, California called KQEK Records, and they've actually been in business for 30 years. They never stopped making vinyl. I mean, vinyl really was never, they never stopped making vinyl. It just, it was kind of underground. And I think, to me, I understand it was more like the college kids that started the trend of it coming back, you know, because they thought it was kind of cool. You know, it's the graphics. I mean, that's the one thing. Obviously, you don't get any graphics really with digital, but you certainly got some graphics with CDs, but not to the extent you're getting with vinyl. It's a lot cooler, you know. In fact, I think I read somewhere where like 40% of people who buy vinyl don't even play them. They just want it for the graphics, you know. And I can understand that. Like, if I was going to buy a picture disc or a colored vinyl, I wouldn't be buying it to play. I just wanted to have my collection. In fact, that's true going back to the original picture discs and colored records. I got some that never played them. I just have them, you know, because, well, you got to have it, you know. It's like if you're a collector, you want it. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of older coming out there, but I know there's some new plants opening up, but the turnaround time is really long. It depends on what you're making, certainly, but it could be up to like 18 weeks, which makes it really hard to plan in advance, especially when you have to deal with it, you know, because you don't know, but issues you can run into. Maybe get test pressings, for example, and most of them are pretty good. Erica does a wonderful job. In fact, they're one of the best, which is why we work with them, and they're great in every way. But there are occasions, you know, you'll get a test pressing that there may be an issue, so that you have to deal with that, and it takes 4 weeks to turn around a test pressing, and so if they have to fix it, then, you know, it could take a few more weeks and delay everything. So, but we run into very few issues like that in terms of test pressing issues, but it can happen.
There's a series of sort of ephemeral documentaries on YouTube, and I remember seeing one that RCA pressed, and it was clearly self-promotional, but it was also a fascinating catalog of what actually goes into making a record. And it's shocking how hands-on it is and how highly technical it is at the same time, where
it is.
it's like all these intermediate stages.
You're delivering to them too. I mean, we have a mastering engineer that's great. He's really good about making sure that what we deliver them is what it's supposed to be. Because, you know, you could deliver a CD master and it's not the same. I mean, you don't want necessarily a vinyl album to sound digital. I mean, the thing about vinyl has always been that they were warmer sounding and you know, the fidelity was better, and that still should be the case, you know. So while obviously everything we get is digital, the sources we do, but my mastering engineer makes sure that what he turns into them sounds like it should be for vinyl, and that's the key right there, making sure it's right for vinyl and different than what you would get if you were doing a digital only release or a CD. That's really important, you know, because sound fidelity is a major factor.
I guess if you are reissuing a record that came out, say, 30 years ago, you go back to the original analog master, so that way you maintain that warm analog sound.
We always try to do that, but the problem you have is that, now, of course, we're a label that doesn't own a lot of masters. So if I'm doing, say, a pop album, we get the best sources we can. They're not necessarily the original source. I mean, it's hard to tell because, you know, everything's been digitized at all the major record labels, or, you know, even studios, and so you know, you get what you get. But since we know the records, we always make sure it sounds the way it's supposed to. And if we're not happy with the source, we'll go to great lengths to find a better source. So, but the record labels, for the most part, have been pretty good about delivering what we need. But we could never guarantee that it's, you know, for the original master source. You know, because, you know, we don't know what they've transferred. I mean, you know, they may have, you know, 10 different types of sources for a particular record, and we have no idea which one we're getting. We can certainly make a request for a particular master with the master numbers and so on, but, you know, and like I said, most labels are pretty good about it, but you can't know, you know, so you have to go by what we're doing on our end to make sure it sounds the way it's supposed to.
I'm not as big of a collector as I used to be when I was in university, because that's when I was buying a huge amount of vinyl. And a massive chunk of it actually was from Varese Sarabande, because that was one of the premier labels that I got into for soundtracks.
Which is great, because on a separate note, you know, we're, especially because we're doing a lot of reissues of our old vinyl titles now, and there are many titles in our catalog we're missing. And so maybe you wouldn't mind if you would be a good source for us to, because we need cover art. And in a lot of cases, sometimes we're missing the records, can't find them. And so we could really use a help and a good source for some of the the vinyl we're putting out. So if you're willing to help us, that'd be fantastic. And of course, we'll make sure that you get copies of the records whenever we do. I mean, happy to do that. But we really could use some help in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, right now it is in storage, but they are accessible.
Okay.
I made a point actually of putting them close to the locker door.
Always things we're missing, it's just because in the old days, while we have a lot of our old catalog titles, there's many things gone over the years because Perez has been in business a long time, and over the years, records are taken or misplaced or we never saved them. I mean, who knows? But there is artwork that you have to retrieve. We don't have, obviously, files of these old things because why would you? In fact, there's no digital files of anything old. So we have to essentially do new scans of the old album covers, and they come out great. No problem about that, but we have to actually have something. And so a lot of times we're missing some artwork, and so consequently, if we had help like yours, that'd be great. I mean, we're also doing original art, too, which also obviously makes a difference. Like we put out The Crow recently, or Scream, which looked great. I mean, the audience seems to love that. It's a big thing, with these new albums, or older albums, I should say, with new art. Because or The Matrix, we did some really cool artwork for that, too. I mean, so, it depends on the release, but there's some cool artwork you can really do with some of these releases.
In talking about the releases, like the latest set of releases, for example, from a collector stance, I mean, if you've been collecting long enough, or even let's say for 10 years, you're aware of the different releases that have come out. So taking, for example, the Matrix album, or even Scream for that example. Right. Scream had an interesting history where it first came out the music, sort of music from an inspired by CD, which had, I believe, 1 or 2 tracks from the original score and the rest were all songs. And then after that, Varese managed to negotiate what I presume were quite expensive music rights issues with Dimension Pictures in order to put out a compilation from the first 2 films. Right. And then afterwards, there was, I believe, a expanded 1 or 2 disc set which featured the entire score.
Yeah, and all the expanded titles now, as far as what we've put out, which we call our CD Club, is all done by Bob Townsend. And Bob, he's in most cases the original producer on a lot of these early soundtracks. So he's been with the label longer than I have. So I give him a lot of credit for what he's been doing, and he knows this stuff inside and out. So he's been able to, and still does, expanded reissues of a lot of our classic soundtracks.
Just in terms of like the LP releases, I'm wondering if in the future for further LP pressings, will Varese, for example, revisit some of the expanded soundtrack albums that came out after the original album, and then perhaps put out 2 LP sets, which I imagine would be more expensive.
Well, yeah, it's possible. I mean, right now we're open to virtually anything. But I don't know at this point yet. I mean, there's different ways we're putting these out. I mean, for different reasons. I mean, for one, of course, we're always doing titles for Record Store Day or for Black Friday. For example, right now, for Black Friday, we're doing 2 titles we're working on that will be coming out. One's a picture disc for the soundtrack to the film Barbarella. Mm-hmm. This was great because the masters have been missing for years, and I found the masters, and we made a deal with Paramount. And we also actually had to get approval from Jane Fonda for the photo we're doing. So we're releasing the actual vinyl later next year, but for this year, for Black Friday, I should say, we're putting out the picture disc of Barbarella. And then we're also doing the soundtrack for the film Popeye that Harry Nilsson did the score for. And that's going to have some added score, which was never on the original soundtrack. And we're also going to do a 2 CD set next year, Popeye, which will include the original score plus the original album plus additional score beyond what's on the vinyl LP, and then a second disc will be all Harry Nilsson demos of the songs that were used in the film. Mm-hmm. So we're working on those. So those will be for Black Friday, and then we're also working on titles for next year right now for Record Store Day, which we will be for April. So we're just putting the list together now. We've got a couple of things we're doing, and there's some in the works. It's hard to say what we'll end up with at this point, but those are 2 main things. And then we also do a lot of special exclusive titles for individual retailers, like Newberry Comics or Barnes & Noble, retailers like that. And they'll come to us, or we'll go to them and say, are you interested in these titles? And then we'll do an exclusive, like, say, 1,000-unit run where it may be a colored vinyl or whatever. And so we'll do it with those retailers. Mm-hmm.
Well, I understand Varese is distributed by Universal, and I wonder if that gives the company an extra advantage, especially when it comes to pressing a larger volume of records, because
not really. I mean, Universal actually doesn't press our product at all. Mm-hmm. We're simply distributed to Universal. We actually do independent distribution for not only our CDs, but also for our vinyl. So Universal doesn't have much of a hand in terms of how we press. There is an occasion or two where we may need their help because they also use Erica Records as well. But generally, we're pretty independent as far as who we use to press our products. Universal helps tremendously with distribution, and that's a whole different story, of course.
I would figure that's one of the more advantages where, because you've got larger distribution, ensures that the records can get to major record stores. So there's, I guess, less of a struggle to sort of assert the titles online.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we don't really ever sell any of our vinyl titles online at all. We really let the retailers handle it, whether it be Amazon or any other brick and mortar retailers. It's just not good business practice, I believe, to sell it on our website, for example, because we want to make sure, especially in the case of vinyl, there are too many things that could happen with a vinyl LP, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen and the customer gets perfect records. So we feel that we're better off having them be sold directly through a major record retailer or whoever does sell vinyl, whether it be a clothing store or Barnes & Noble, whatever. It's just, we just feel it's better to do it that way.
Yeah, and I guess one way of looking at it as well is that if labels are pressing vinyl and they have that specific philosophy where they want people to get it in the stores, they're essentially continuing that experience of actually going into a bricks and mortar store and just sort of searching, looking, spending time, and sort of examining the product as opposed to looking simply at an icon on a page.
I agree. Look, there's no better experience than going into a record store. It's actually no different than seeing a movie in the movie theater as opposed to seeing it at home. Yeah, you can see it at home and it's great, but the experience is so different. I mean, it's like seeing a movie in a movie theater is the best experience ever because you're sitting with other people and you experience it with them. And same thing going to a record store. You're there with other people, and you're looking at records and you're going to see things you would not have even looked for. I mean, Amazon's great. They recommend titles and that's fantastic. But you're going to see things that nobody was going to recommend to you, and you thought, oh my God, I didn't even know this was out. And there's just no better experience. I mean, in my opinion, I've worked in record stores myself for many years, and so I'm a big proponent of record stores. And so I'm glad that they're still alive, and hopefully they'll stay healthy for a while.
If a soundtrack came out initially on LP and then it got issued later on CD, if you choose to reissue it on LP, are there any unique licensing rights there, or have they suddenly been? Yeah,
it depends on the release. I mean, there are many titles, not as many as we'd like, that we actually have rights in perpetuity, which means that even though we don't own the master, the deal we put together originally was in perpetuity, so we can do whatever we want with it. Then there's other titles that we've put out that we have to go back to whoever owns it now, and in a lot of cases it may be somebody completely different, and we have to make a new deal to put it back out. So we can't just put it out because those deals expired after a certain point. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of titles we have to do that with. So a lot of the catalog titles you're seeing now, we've had to go back and negotiate a new deal.
And just out of curiosity, do you know whatever happened to KM Records? Because I think they were the original manufacturer of Varese's LPs.
Yes, they were. I don't really know. I think they were probably, I would say, taken over by somebody else at some point, because that seems to be what's happening. The mergers and the downsizing of manufacturing. I don't know the history, although I know them, of course, and I remember we were working with them even when I first started for Res, but I certainly must have been taken over by somebody else at this point.
The Force LPs that have come out so far, I guess these are the first new soundtrack LPs that Varese has put out, from what I can recall, since 1989, because I think the last LP that they put out was Jerry Goldsmith's Leviathan.
Actually, no, we've now been doing vinyl for close to 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we started out just doing some pop titles. We've expanded tremendously, but we've put out vinyl pretty consistently now for like the last 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
This year we've really stepped up our game as far as titles are going, but the last several years we've really increased the numbers based on demand and what we have in our catalog and interest.
And just in closing, how do you feel about the fact that a younger generation they actually prefer to have vinyl? Because there's several colleagues that I work with, and they're in their 20s, and they buy records, and they have record players, and eventually they will probably upgrade to tube amplifiers because they want to have that sort of full experience of having the analog sound.
Oh, I think it's great. I mean, that's really the driving force, I think, for a lot of these releases. They're discovering albums that we've known for years, and they're just now finding them. again, it's so many different factors. I mean, again, the sound, the graphics, just everything. And everybody has their own opinion what why they're buying them, but obviously a lot of people are buying just to play because they sound so good. It's a different experience. I mean, there's no experience with listening to digital, and CDs, like I said, are great, but it's different. You have to, I guess in some respects, pay attention when you're listening to the album, vinyl album, as opposed to a CD. You can just throw a CD on and drive in your car and everything, but you can't do that on an LP. You certainly can't play it in your car. So I think you have to actually be there and listen to it. It's just a different experience, because it's not like you can just put it on and ignore it. It's like, if you ignore it, it's going to go off the end. It's you kind of have to be there, and I think that it's a different experience because of it. Because you're participating more, as opposed to anything else.
I guess the only biggest challenge as one starts to get into it, and one that I'm sure you're well of, is storage issues, where it just becomes a challenge to find space. Oh,
yeah. Well, that's very true. I built cabinets in my garage because I had no choice, and they're double deep, and I have, fortunately my garage doesn't get any direct sunlight or anything, and the temperature's cool, but, yeah, you have, because obviously they work, too. So, yeah, storage is a big issue because they're big, and... But I've been dealing with it for such a long time, I don't even think about it, I mean, I've got room, and, it's okay. I mean, for the average person buying them, I'm sure they don't have nearly as many as I do, and whatever they've got probably works for them. They may have a cabinet, and they put some albums in there, and they're happy with it.
There was a story I read years ago of a collector in Italy who built an extension to his house for his 30,000 LP collection, which spanned every international edition of every title he could get his hands on. And one day the foundation crumbled from the weight of his platters. I think he went a little too far in not being satisfied in having the pressing that was the most pleasing and accurate to his ears instead of gathering everything under the sun. I have a few upcoming LP reviews. I'm just waiting for them to arrive in the mail. But if time permits, I would like to follow this chat with other label interviews because there's much to producing good music for picky ears and eyes. Check out KQEK.com for a review of Varese's new LP edition of John Powell's The Bourne Identity, and links to some related reviews you should read, including Ellen Zweig's 2000 documentary on extreme vinyl collectors, and a series of contemporary and archival documentaries on the history of vinyl from manufacturing, innovation, the embrace by the public, and its downfall in the mass market when CDs took flight. Special thanks to Cary Mansfield for his generous time, Varese Sarabande Records, and Beth Krakauer at the Krakauer Group for facilitating this interview. You can follow KQEK.com's reviews and interviews via our Facebook page and Twitter updates via mondomark_KQEK. This podcast was produced by Big Head Amusements and is copyrighted 2016 by Mark R. Hassan.